The chill of the early morning wind carried with it an unsettling stillness, as if it had gathered all the forgotten whispers of the past. Watch as this heart-wrenching moment unfolds, changing everything the chief thought he knew. Don't miss this intense and emotional journey of truth and discovery. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more captivating stories. Chief Damien Bishop stepped outside the precinct, the weight of his boots making a resounding echo against the pavement. His uniform, worn with the years and experiences it had witnessed, hung heavily on his shoulders. For nearly 20 years, his partner, Archer, a loyal Belgian Malinois, had been by his side. They had shared countless patrols, arrests, and moments where time seemed to slow down. Archer wasn't just a dog. He was the embodiment of trust, loyalty, and silent strength. Yet today, something was different. The air felt thick with tension, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Damien barely had time to take 3 steps when Archer, usually so alert and focused, froze mid-stride. His strong frame stiffened, his ears perked toward the precinct's front doors. There was a subtle, strange quiver in the dog's body, as if something unspoken was settling in the air. Damien halted and knelt beside Archer, concern knitting his brows. "Archer," he murmured, his voice a mix of command and concern. But the dog didn't respond. Instead, a low, almost mournful whine escaped from him. A sound Damien had only ever heard during their early days together, in training. This wasn't a whine of fear, nor was it a sign of danger. It was something deeper, something old, something familiar. Damien's gaze shifted back to the precinct's entrance. Everything appeared as it should. The glass doors, the sign above the entrance, the officers inside going about their duties. But something inside him stirred. Something wasn't right. His eyes caught sight of a bulletin board inside the lobby. A sheet of paper had been tacked to it, crooked, out of place, and almost mocking in its quiet presence. It hadn't been there earlier that day. Damien felt a weight settle in his chest. He could feel his pulse quicken, an instinctive warning flaring up within him. He turned toward the door. "Stay here, Archer," he ordered, though the dog remained unmoving. Archer's body language was clear. He was rooted to the ground as if he physically couldn't move. Damien didn't wait for any further hesitation. He pulled open the door and stepped inside, his boots clicking against the polished floor. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, flickering slightly. There it was, the photo. A grainy, poorly lit image on the bulletin board. It was of an alleyway drenched in shadow. A man, face down, lifeless, in a pool of blood. Standing over him was a much younger version of Damien, his hand resting on his weapon, the other holding the leash of Archer, who was poised in a stance of alertness. The image was like a punch to his gut. That night, damn it, that night, was supposed to be buried. The case had been sealed, forgotten by all but the men who had lived through it. And yet here it was, exposed for the whole precinct to see. The words scrawled beneath the photo were chilling. "The past never stays buried." Damien's hands trembled as he reached up, feeling as if the very air around him was suffocating him. Archer had been there. Archer had been with him in that alley, in that moment of raw chaos. That night, a choice had been made, and now it was clawing its way to the surface. He could see Archer outside through the glass doors. The dog had sunk to the ground, his body language full of pain, his eyes fixed on something only he could remember. Damien stood motionless, feeling the walls of the precinct closing in on him. Someone had placed the photo there on purpose, someone who wanted him to remember, to confront a past that had long been buried. He didn't want to face it. He didn't want to face himself. The leash slipped from his fingers, his legs shaking as he stumbled back toward the door. Archer's whine, quieter now but still present, reached his ears as he stepped outside. But the dog didn't move. He stayed where he was, frozen, as if he too was reliving the past. Damien crouched beside Archer, brushing a hand over the dog's fur. He had promised himself that night would remain silent. He had buried the memories deep, shoved them to the back of his mind. But Archer, his loyal companion, hadn't forgotten. The scar on Archer's shoulder, nearly hidden beneath the thick fur, was a stark reminder of that night, a wound that never healed, a memory that never faded. Damien exhaled sharply, his mind racing. That night, the alley, the blood, the screams, the gunshot, and the man, the one who had been killed. What had really happened? What was the truth? He had convinced himself it was justified. But now, the cracks were showing. Now the past was reaching out with its cold fingers, demanding to be acknowledged. A voice cut through the quiet air. "We need to talk," it said, breaking through the fog of his thoughts. He turned to see Ray, a former officer and the only other man who had been there that night, standing just a few feet away. Damien nodded but didn't say a word. Ray was the only one who could understand what was happening, the only one who knew the truth, or at least part of it. Ray led him to a cabin on the outskirts of town, tucked away in the woods. As they pulled up, Damien could sense the tension in the air. Archer was on edge, his body tense, every muscle alert. Something was wrong. Ray led him inside, to a table piled with old records, and there, sitting innocently, was another photo, one even more damning than the last. A photograph of the alley, the blood, the body. And in the corner of the image, a shadow. Another person. The third man who had been there that night. Ray's voice trembled as he spoke. "I didn't tell you everything, Damien. I didn't know what to say. But I knew that photo would surface eventually." And then, the revelation that shattered Damien's already fractured world. There's more. Someone else was there. Someone who shouldn't have been. As the night stretched on, the pieces of the past began to fall into place. Damien realized that the secrets of that night had never been his alone. And now someone was making him pay for the lies, for the things he had buried. But why? And who? As the fog rolled over the town once more, Archer's growl echoed through the woods, signaling that the past wasn't done with them. Not yet. The sound of a phone ringing brought Damien back to the present. His mind raced, his heart pounding. This wasn't over. It had only just begun. There were answers to be found, but at what cost? Who had been watching them? Who had been pulling the strings? And as Damien turned toward Archer, the only constant in his life, he knew that whatever the truth was, it would be revealed. But it wouldn't be easy. No, the truth was buried deep, and they were going to have to dig into the shadows, into the past, and they were going to find it, no matter how dark the road ahead would be. "Let's go, Archer," Damien said, determination in his voice. The past was waiting, and it had never been more dangerous. Damien Bishop could feel his pulse pounding in his ears, the weight of the past pushing down on him like an unseen hand. The cold air outside the cabin wrapped around him. But the chill that had settled in his bones was something far deeper. It was a feeling he had buried long ago, one that only now began to claw its way to the surface. Archer, the dog who had been by his side through every trial, every victory, every failure, was no longer just a witness. He had become the mirror to the past Damien had tried so desperately to forget. And as they stood there in that dimly lit cabin, the truth that had been buried for 15 years was finally starting to emerge, piece by piece. Ray Calderon was standing at the doorway of the cabin, his face pale, his eyes haunted. Damien hadn't seen his old partner in years, not since they had parted ways. And now, seeing him here, standing in front of him like a ghost from the past, only added to the weight that was already crushing his chest. "Ray," Damien said, his voice rough, as if trying to force words through a throat filled with regret. "You need to tell me everything. We can't keep running from this anymore." Ray nodded, his lips tight. "I've been running, Damien. We both have." He motioned for Damien to sit at the old wooden table, the floor creaking under their weight. "You need to hear the whole story. All of it. The truth you've been avoiding." The words hit Damien like a physical blow. He didn't want to hear them, didn't want to remember, didn't want to confront the choices they had made that night. But he knew, deep down, that there was no other way. Archer, now lying by the door, his eyes alert, was the only one who had been there, who had seen everything unfold. Ray took a deep breath, exhaling slowly, as if he were preparing for something difficult to say. That night in the alley, it wasn't just you and me, Damien. There was someone else there. Another officer. He didn't have the same intentions as us. He didn't want to stop the situation. He wanted to make sure it ended, no matter the cost. Damien felt his stomach twist. "Who?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Ray's eyes darted to the window, checking to see if anyone was listening. A man named Frank McAllister. He was a member of our squad at the time. But he was different. He wasn't like the rest of us. He was obsessed with making an example of people. You remember that night? The man in the alley, Emilio. He didn't have a weapon. He wasn't a threat. Damien's hand clenched into a fist as the memories came rushing back. Emilio, a small-time informant who had promised to help them with a major case. But when it came down to it, Emilio had been cornered. He'd been pleading, terrified. He hadn't reached for a weapon. He had simply been trying to survive. But Frank had seen it differently. He had seen a chance to make a statement. Frank was the one who shot him, wasn't he? Damien asked, his voice barely audible. Ray nodded, his face etched with shame. He pulled the trigger. You were the one who fired first, but it wasn't meant to be fatal. Frank made sure of it. He was the one who sealed Emilio's fate, and then he made it look like you did it. He set you up to carry the guilt. Damien's world tilted. Why? Why would he do that? Because he wanted to control the narrative, Ray said quietly. He wanted the department to believe you were the one who lost control. He wanted to keep his hands clean. The realization hit Damien hard. All these years, he had carried the weight of Emilio's death, convinced that he had made the right choice. But the truth was far uglier than he had imagined. Frank had used him as a scapegoat, manipulated the situation, and let him believe the lie. And worst of all, he had forced Archer to carry the burden too. Archer, the one who had been there in the alley, who had witnessed everything. The dog who had never forgotten. Damien stood up abruptly, his chair scraping across the floor. We need to find him, Ray. We need to find Frank. Ray looked at him, fear in his eyes. It's too late, Damien. Frank's gone. He vanished after the shooting. He's disappeared, and I've never heard from him again. Damien's heart sank. Gone. He repeated. You mean he just left? After everything he did? Ray nodded. He was careful. He knew what he was doing. He made sure no one would ever trace the bullet back to him. And he made sure you would live with the consequences. The silence in the room grew heavier with each passing second. Damien felt like he was drowning in it. The truth was worse than he had ever imagined. Not only had he been set up, but the man who had betrayed him, who had destroyed his life, had vanished without a trace, leaving him with the pieces to pick up. Ray spoke again, his voice soft but firm. But it's not over, Damien. There's someone else involved in all of this, someone who wants to make sure the truth comes out. And they've been watching us. They've been following us. Damien's eyes widened. What do you mean? Who's watching us? Ray's voice dropped to a whisper. Louis Cartes, Emilio's brother. Damien felt his breath catch in his throat. Louis Cartes. The guy who's been sending us the photos. The ones with the note. He paused, trying to piece everything together. He's the one who's been digging up the past. Ray nodded grimly. He's the one who has the answers. And he's the one who's been playing this game. He's not going to stop until he gets what he wants. Damien knew this was it. The moment where everything changed. The past wasn't just a shadow haunting him anymore. It was coming for him. For Archer, and for everyone who had been part of the story. We need to find him, Damien said, his voice steady despite the fear that gripped him. We need to stop him before he does any more damage. The chase begins. That night, Damien and Ray drove to the outskirts of town once again, heading toward a dilapidated building just outside the city limits. They knew the risk, but there was no turning back. They had to find Louis Cartz. The answers, the closure, it all hinged on this meeting. Archer sat quietly in the back of the car, his eyes focused, alert. It was as if the dog knew exactly what was at stake, as if he understood the gravity of the situation in ways Damien couldn't. The city's lights flickered in the distance, swallowed by the dark, and the road ahead seemed to stretch on forever. As they pulled up to the abandoned building, Damien's heart pounded in his chest. This was where it would all come to a head. This was where the truth would finally be revealed. The door creaked open, and Damien stepped into the cold night air, his hand gripping the handle of his gun. Ray stood beside him, looking more like a man out of time than a former officer, but there was something in his eyes now, something that made Damien realize that they weren't alone in this fight anymore. And then they heard it. The sound of footsteps, soft but deliberate, echoing in the dark. They weren't alone. Louis Cartz was waiting. The final chapter was about to begin.